Välkomna till Se människan-scenen. Nu ska vi få lyssna på ett samtal mellan Bryan Stevenson, som har skrivit boken Riggad sanning. Han kommer att samtala med Alf Linderman, som är direktor på Sigtuna-stiftelsen. Samtalet kommer att hållas på engelska. Welcome.
Bryan Stevenson, welcome to Sweden.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here. I'm already impressed because I learned that you have arrived here just a couple of hours ago.
That's true, yes.
You look in good shape for,
Thank you.
arriving. So. You're an American lawyer, and you have written a fascinating book about your work among poor people in the south of the United States. And let me just first say that it was a very strong experience to read your book. And I see it as a privilege to now being able to talk to you about it. The book was originally published in 2015, but very recently translated to Swedish and published here in Sweden. And the Swedish title is, as you see, Riggad sanning, but the original title was Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. It might be interesting, by the way, to know that your book has also been transformed into a movie that was premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival earlier in September and is scheduled to be accessible more widely next year. Yeah. Were you in Toronto?
Yes, I was, yeah, and I'm very excited about the movie. It focuses on just one of the main cases that I write about in the book, the case of Walter McMillian. But for me, this has always been about getting people to know more and to see more about the crisis that's happening in the U.S. Around excessive punishment and over-incarceration. And I'm really proud of the movie. We've got some wonderful, talented actors, Michael B. Jordan, Jamie Foxx, Brie Larson, really bring this story in a really meaningful way, and so I'm hoping that people will become even more interested after seeing the film.
I look forward to be able to see it. You were born in 1959 and you grew up in the deep south of the US. You have experienced racism and segregation in your own life. You were an excellent student, I've learned, and eventually you received a full scholarship to attend Harvard Law School. I think it's important to mention that Harvard Law School, of course, is part of Harvard University, which is one of the more prestigious universities in the US, one of those Ivy League schools that we talk about. Having a law degree from Harvard would have been possible to be your ticket to a very prosperous future, but you chose to go a different path. Tell us about what you did after you got the degree in Harvard, and perhaps also why you did not try to seek personal advantages from having a law degree from there.
Well, I think growing up in the rural South where I started my education in a colored school. They did not let black kids go to the public schools when I was a little boy. There were no high schools for black people when my dad was a teenager, so he couldn't go to high school. And lawyers came into our community and made it possible for me to go to high school, go to college. And I was never confused about the fact that this was a triumph of the law and rights rather than democracy. If we had a vote on ending racial segregation in my community, we would have never ended racial segregation. And so the power that lawyers had to protect disfavored people, people who were marginalized, people who were excluded, was something that I never forgot. My parents were humiliated every day during the Jim Crow era. We grew up around the signage that said white and colored. They weren't directions, they were assaults. My grandparents were terrorized during the period of lynching. And my great-grandparents were enslaved, and so that consciousness that was given to me by my foreparents of slavery and lynching and segregation wasn't something that I could abandon just because I graduated from Harvard Law School. And I knew that there were still millions of poor people, people of color, suffering in this era of over-incarceration. And once I got connected and realized that we had a criminal justice system in America that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Once I realized that people were actually being executed wrongly, I felt like I had no choice but to respond to that. And it didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a privilege to stand with the condemned and the poor and the marginalized. They were a community of people who reminded me of my community. I could just as easily imagine being behind the bars than in front of the bars, given the way that system works. And so once I discovered that there was something maybe I could contribute to helping people on death row, I made that choice. It wasn't very lucrative, it wasn't very easy, but the work was very engaging. And I guess I'm still persuaded that we need the rule of law to protect people all over the world who are disfavored, who are marginalized, for whom the political process will not work because we have a hard time recognizing the humanity and the value and the dignity of people who have been otherized. And because I still feel that, for me it was really critical to play a role standing with that community, the community that I'm from.
So was this a vision that you had with you throughout the university education, that you would use it this way?
You know, to be honest, I didn't really think much. I mean, I was a philosophy major in college with no clear understanding that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I got to be a senior, and one day somebody came up to me and said, you know, nobody's going to pay you to philosophize when you graduate from college. And I actually looked into graduate work into different areas and ultimately settled on the law. It was during my law school career that I had an internship where I went to death row and met a man who didn't have a lawyer, and we had this amazing conversation. It turned out he was exactly my age. He had seen my birthday. And we were just talking, and I write about it in the book. I was only scheduled to be there an hour, and I stayed 3 hours. And because I went way past the time, the guards got angry, and they came bursting into the area, and they were very upset. So they took it out on this condemned man who they threw against a wall. They pulled his arms behind his back. They put the handcuffs on his wrists so tight that you could see the metal pinching. They wrapped a chain around his waist. They put the shackles on his ankles. And I was sitting there in just horrified at the way they were treating him. And I begged them to be gentler, but they didn't pay it any attention. And they started shoving this man toward the door. And before he got to the door, he planted his feet. And then he turned to me and he said, "Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back." And then he did this thing that I've never forgotten. He stood there and he closed his eyes. He threw his head back and he began to sing. And he sang this hymn. He started singing, "I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." And everybody stopped. And then the guards recovered and they started pushing him down the hallway, and you could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. And when I heard that man sing, everything changed for me, because that's when I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. And it radicalized my interest in the law. When I went back to Harvard, you couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything necessary to help me help condemned people. And so in many ways, it was a calling. It was seeing the humanity and the dignity of condemned prisoners be disregarded that called me to this challenge, this journey of trying to represent the condemned. And in many ways, I still hear that man singing today. And that's the beauty of what I do, is I get to see human beings who've been told that their lives have no meaning or purpose or value, that they are beyond worth, that they should be exterminated. And what I see is something that challenges that in very profound ways. And when you see that, it's not hard to want to fight for that humanity that you see, that dignity that you see. And that's been my experience ever since I've started this work.
That story is part of your book, early in the book. And the book is saturated with numerous stories about people in legal difficulties of various kind. and that you have tried to help, and sometimes you succeeded to help them and sometimes not. But there's one story that is sort of the main story of the book. You already mentioned the name, and that's the story about Walter McMillian.
Yeah.
Who was Walter McMillian, or who is Walter McMillian?
Yeah, so Walter McMillian was one of nearly 200 people who'd been sentenced to death in the state of Alabama. What was interesting about his case, and which is why I focused on it, is that Walter McMillian lived in Monroeville, Alabama, which is actually the place where Harper Lee grew up and wrote the fictional novel To Kill a Mockingbird. And the characters that are in that novel were actually people who lived in that community. Her father was a lawyer. That community embraced that story. They romanticized that story. And when I got the case, I was struck by the irony that this was a community that loved the story of To Kill a Mockingbird, and yet they were comfortable prosecuting this innocent man and sentencing him to death. It was a murder of a young white woman in downtown Monroeville. The police couldn't solve the crime. 6 months go by. Because Mr. McMillian had had an affair with a young white woman, he became a suspect. He was ultimately put on death row before the trial, then convicted, then sentenced to life without parole, but the trial judge had the authority to override the jury's verdict of life. And so the trial judge overrode the jury's verdict and imposed the death penalty, and that's when I met Mr. McMillian. It was an interesting case because the evidence of his innocence was so clear. He was 11 miles away when the crime took place. There were 40 or 50 black people who were with him, and the state still ignored that evidence. And it was one of these cases where I got a lot of bomb threats and death threats, and people were very hostile to my representation of him. And I guess I wanted to expose the way in which fear and anger can make us comfortable and accepting of things that we should never accept. And that, for me, was the narrative behind this. I think mass incarceration in America, and I think abuse of people all over the world, have at the root narratives of fear and anger. And when we allow ourselves to be governed by fear and governed by anger, we accept things that we should never accept. We tolerate things we should never tolerate. And that's what that case brought to mind, because people didn't want to accept that they might have an innocent man on death row. He spent 6 years on death row. We ultimately won his release. Very tragically, his time on death row was very traumatizing, and he developed early onset dementia, and he died several years later in ways that were quite sad, because we don't compensate people who have been wrongly convicted in the U.S. in many states. But it's the heart of the story I tell in the book.
When I read the story about Walter McMillian, it was difficult for me actually to understand. You described that it was a poor trial in many ways, and his previous lawyers did not do a good job in defending him. But you had met all these people who actually were together with him at the time of the murder.
Right.
And still, even if you had witnesses saying that he was here, and a big number of witnesses, you still felt that you had to dig out more and more and more evidence. And even when I read that you had all this other information about the car and everything, you were still not completely convinced that he would be freed.
Yeah.
That's so difficult to understand.
Well, I think, we have not created a system that's very comfortable admitting mistakes. I think our political culture right now is a political culture that denies wrongdoing, even when the evidence of wrongdoing is very clear. I don't think we do mistake very well in America. I don't think we do shame very well. And I think that consciousness means that we have a criminal justice system that, even when you're presenting direct evidence of innocence, is very reluctant to acknowledge that. And so, yes, we had all of these witnesses who could confirm that he was not there when the crime took place. We even had a police officer who came and got something at this fish fry he was managing. The man who testified against him had been coerced to testify falsely. And we had tapes where he was being coerced to testify falsely. And even with all of that evidence, When I presented it to the court the first time, the court ruled against us, basically because they did not want to acknowledge his innocence. And I think that's still true. I've talked about another client, a man named Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent 30 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. And we had very dramatic evidence of his innocence. I mean, right now in the United States, for every 9 people we have executed, we've identified one innocent person on death row. That is, we've now exonerated over 160 death row prisoners who were proven innocent. And that's a shocking rate of error, and yet states are still carrying out executions. And I don't think if someone said, if here in Sweden, we had evidence that 1 out of every 9 apples is poisonous, and if you touch it, you will die, no one would be selling apples. If for every 9 planes that took off, 1 crashed and everyone died, we would not fly. We would not accept that error, but in the context of a death penalty that primarily targets the poor and people of color, we seem to have a much greater tolerance for error. And that's the reason why you had to have such dramatic evidence to win a case like this, and why it becomes so difficult.
Walter was released, and that's the main story, and that even though it was very, very troublesome to read about his experience, it was good to know that he was released. But there are so many different dramatic stories in your book, and I was especially touched by the story about the war veteran Herbert Richardson. It was legally wrong, but he was killed eventually in the electric chair in 1989. And you worked for him, you tried to get him free, and you were with him all the way up to the end. What does experiences like that do to you as a person?
Well, I think they're challenging, there's no question about it. Yeah, he was a Vietnam vet who was traumatized. He did not intend to kill anybody, but he put a bomb on this woman's porch because he was trying to get her to be more dependent on him. It's very misguided. And a child picked it up and was killed. He did not get legal representation. I got involved very late in the process. I think the hardest thing for me was confronting how we fail our veterans, how we fail so many people who are dealing with disabilities, how we fail the mentally ill. And on the night of the execution, I went down there to be with him, and we had this very just unforgettable conversation. He told me when I got there, it was about 20 minutes before the execution, and during these days, they used the electric chair. They would strap you in a chair and they would execute you that way. But when I got there, he said, "Bryan, it's been so strange. When I woke up this morning, the guard said to me, 'What do you want for breakfast?' And at midday, they said, 'What do you want for lunch?' In the evening, they said, 'What do you want for dinner?' He said, all day long, people have been asking me, 'Can I get you coffee? Can I get you water? Can I get you access to the phone? Do you need stamps for your mail?' And I never will forget him saying to me, he said, 'Bryan, it's been so strange.' He said, 'More people have said, what can I do to help you in the last 14 hours of my life than they ever did in the first 19 years of my life.' And I was standing there holding that man's hands thinking, yes, where were they when you were 3 and your mom died? Where were they when you were 7 and you were being physically and sexually abused? Where were they when you were 11 and you were drug addicted? Where were they when you were 19 and you came back from Vietnam traumatized?' And with those kinds of questions resonating in my mind, it was painful to see this man pulled away and strapped into an electric chair and burned to death. But the pain of it just reinforced for me the importance of being an advocate for people whose humanity is being denied. We shared something there. He was a vet. He had a flag that he was entitled as a vet. And about a week later, I got in the mail his flag. And I kept that flag because for me, it was a symbol of how important it is that we keep fighting for those who have been mistreated and abused. And so while it is challenging, I'm the product of a movement that had to do so much work. I'm standing on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. And I live in Montgomery, Alabama, where Rosa Parks and Dr. King and so many others had to frequently say, "My head is bloodied but not bowed." I've never had to say that. And so that orients you to doing this kind of work, even when you have to go through something difficult, like an execution.
Bryan Stevenson, thank you so much for having this conversation with me here, and thank you so much for this book.
Thank you.